As debates continue to rage across the political spectrum about whether or not or in what ways we should be considering reopening the economy, Texas Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick went on Tucker Carlson to explain his view that we should be reopening the economy now. So let's take a look at that, then we'll be back to talk about it.
Thanks so much for coming on. So
Sure.
you were pretty clear in what you thought might happen in our conversation a month ago. You said if they don't pull us back a little bit, you're going to see a lot of people out of work and you're going to see the economy crushed. Do you think you've been vindicated?
I'm sorry that I'm vindicated. I wish it hadn't happened, Tucker, but I'm a small business guy and I've been around the block long enough to see what was going to happen. When you start shutting down society and people start losing their paychecks and businesses can't open and governments aren't getting revenues and go on and on and on and on. So I'm sorry to say that I was right on this. And I'm thankful that we are now, Tucker, finally beginning to open up Texas and other states because it's been long overdue. You know, they told us, Tucker, to follow the science. Well, what science? I mean, at the end of January, Dr. Fauci, who I have great respect for, said this wasn't a big issue. 3 weeks later, we were going to lose 2 million people. Another few weeks later, it was 1 to 200,000. Now it's under 60,000. And we've had the wrong numbers, the wrong science. And I don't blame them. But let's face reality of where we are. In Texas, we have 29 million people. We've lost 495, and every life is valuable. But 500 people out of 29 million, and we're locked down, and we're crushing the average worker. We're crushing small business. We're crushing the markets. We're crushing this country. And what I said when I was with you that night, there are more important things than living, and that's saving this country for my children and my grandchildren, and saving this country for all of us. And I don't want to die. Nobody wants to die. But man, we got to take some risk and get back in the game and get this country back up and running. It's actually, the death rate has been low. And again, every life is precious. I don't diminish one life. But our country should not have been locked down. And now, you know, I've always said if the Democrats ever had total control, they would put people like you and me in jail and throw away the key. And that's what they're doing because they now have total control, Tucker. They have total control. And everywhere you see this draconian rules of locking down people and keeping businesses shut and destroying our country, it's mostly Democrat governors, Democrat county judges, Democrat mayors, almost everywhere.
So you just saw there Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick arguing that, look, this stuff has been going on too long. People are really, really suffering economically. And if you look at the numbers, that seems to be true. That is true. I mean, we just saw today 4.4 million new people filing for unemployment, bringing the total claims number to over 26 million in only 5 weeks. Guys, we have never seen anything like this. I mean, these numbers are completely insane. The economy is completely falling off a cliff. But, you know, where I do disagree with Dan Patrick is that the only alternatives that we have in front of us are, you know, we open up the economy and risk people of, you know, lowered immune system, risk the elderly, risk people with kind of pre-existing conditions, or whether or not we destroy the economy. We've seen proposals coming from Republicans and from Democrats. So this is a proposal from Josh Hawley. Josh Hawley is a Republican. You can see it's written, this is a proposal in the Washington Post written by Josh Hawley, the Republican in the Senate, arguing that beginning immediately, the federal government should cover 80% of wages for workers at any U.S. business up to the median wage until the emergency is over. Now, Josh Hawley, being a Republican, is proposing it through a kind of tax rebate system to the businesses, and that's how we're going to pay for it. So it's not the same as some of the proposals that we've seen from the Democrats, where you can see here Tim Ryan, who's, you know, he is kind of, I mean, Tim Ryan's more of a centrist Democrat. He's not like a far lefty Democrat, but he's arguing that, you know, Americans up to should get up to $2,000 a month tax-free in order, basically until this thing is over, and he's bringing that in with Ro Khanna. So we've seen proposals from both Republicans and Democrats across the spectrum, all over the place, to how we might be able to handle this economic crisis and how we might be able to, you know, keep the economy closed and help protect the average person a little bit more. How we can protect people with weakened immune system, how we can protect people with various kinds of pre-existing conditions, sort of conditions which might make things worse. We've seen proposals that can help. And so I do disagree with Dan Patrick that, you know, when it comes down to it, the only option here are we open up the economy and, you know, risk our elderly people, risk the people with poor immune system, or we destroy the economy, keeping it closed while helping, protect public health. There are other options. Now, at the end of the day, is it still a trade-off? Yes. I mean, there is no denying that. Someone somewhere somehow is going to need to sacrifice. But the question is not just, do we let the, low-income workers who are already struggling day to day when it comes to, living paycheck to paycheck, are they the ones who struggle when we close down the economy? Or are we just going to let the people just die who have, various kinds of health conditions? My dad has a heart condition, and he very likely is in one of those high-risk categories that, I don't want to see the economy reopen too quickly, too fast. It's really, really dangerous. People are going to die, and it's not good. So there needs to be a serious kind of balance struck. But the other option, of course, when I say that someone needs to sacrifice is, guys, rich people are going to need to sacrifice. They're going to need to kick in. They're going to need to pay more taxes. Maybe, obviously not this year because they can't, but in the coming years, we're going to need to increase taxes on the wealthier side of things, simply because of the fact that this is really expensive. And they're the ones who, look, they're Americans too. And we're in the middle of a crisis. We need to come together during this time of crisis. And all of us who have means, who are able to provide in some way and somehow, need to pitch in the best way that they can. And the best way for people with high incomes to pitch in and help during this time of crisis is, quite frankly, with their money. They need to pitch in and they need to provide effort. They need to provide in terms of taxes, in terms of, some of the economic resources that they've built, and oftentimes built on top of our backs. We've, been the labor for them to help them make their money. And I think it's time for them to pitch back. It's time for them to help out us while we're struggling down here at the bottom. And I think that that's really the only way, right? There needs to be some kind of path. Again, whether or not we take the Republican path of providing 80% of everyone's paycheck up to the median wage through a tax rebate, or we take the Democrat path, or the sort of lefter path of providing a direct sort of cash payment. Which path we choose, that's up for public debate. But the idea that we just reopen the economy immediately, guys, we can't do it that way. We can't just let people die. Government exists right to protect us and to keep, provide things such as the public health. And we can't just let people, with poor immune systems, we can't just let the elderly who have been fighting for us and, working, who were the workers at one point building up the economy. We can't just, now that they're older, we just, kick them to the dustbin and let them die. That's not fair. They earned their stay, right? They worked hard. So it's not fair to do that. And so we've got to sacrifice, for other people. Everyone's got to pitch in some way. And that's simply what has to happen during a time of crisis, guys. Now, the other thing I do want to show you, though, is I completely disagree with Dan Patrick when it comes to some of this coronavirus stuff. Because one of the things that he said there, if you were listening, is he said that, well, we had the wrong science. This is here is Dr. Fauci here on, you can see here, March 15th, saying that if people think we're overreacting, that means we're doing it right. And the reason why, the sort of argument behind that, is that if people start obeying social distancing rules, if people start complying, then yeah, the numbers are going to go down lower than the models. Because guys, models can only predict things in, making certain assumptions. And so they make assumptions assuming that people keep doing what they're doing, right? So the numbers that we first saw where a couple million people die were assuming that nothing changes. We keep the gyms open. We keep, the barber shops open. We keep everything open. Right. And so when you start closing stuff down, when everyone starts wearing masks, if you've been to the grocery store, you know that everybody's wearing masks right now. Everybody's wearing gloves. Right. Yeah, that changes the numbers. That brings down the projections. That brings down the numbers. And so you can't just be like, oh, well, look, the numbers have changed from the past. And so that means that the science was wrong. No, what it means is that people are now complying. When the White House came out with those numbers saying that it was between 100 and 240,000 people were going to die, we've seen now that it was assuming 50% compliance to social distancing. But what we're seeing right now in this country is closer to 90, all the way up to maybe even 94% compliance with social distancing. So yeah, those numbers are cutting down, and now projections are saying maybe 65 to 75,000 people are going to die through the course of this thing. But that's, again, assuming, right? That model then still assumes that we keep our social distance compliance at the levels that it's at right now. So that would be if we kept keeping the economy closed the exact way that we're doing it right now, for a couple more months, then we would only see those numbers. But if we don't do that, if we start reopening things, then those projections that we're seeing right now are going to start going up again, right? It's really simple. It's not super complicated, not super difficult to understand. And I'm not super happy that Dan Patrick isn't expressing that nuance nuance there, because you can do both, right? Like he could argue for his position while still expressing the nuance when it comes to this, but he's not giving, he's not giving his viewers the nuance so that then the viewers can make up their own mind, and that's something that I'm not particularly happy with. I don't think that that's really, a particularly great example of sort of, how we should present ourselves in democratic discourse. Now, the other thing, though, of course, is that part of the thing that we're seeing here, part of the big divide that we're seeing between Republicans and Democrats, of course, is that Democratic states tend to be the ones who are hit the hardest. Now, there are exceptions. For instance, Oregon right here, they were very quick to act and quick to shut things down. But a lot of Republican states tend to have fewer large cities, and large cities tend to be the ones that are hit the hardest, right? And so Democratic states having large cities tend to be the ones most affected. We just saw here, I mean, you can look here, New York State having the vast majority of the deaths, also here in New Jersey. I live here in DC. Some of the DC numbers are starting to bring up into peak. And so, and then when it comes to the Virginia numbers here, the vast majority of the overall Virginia numbers are actually from Northern Virginia near DC, where I live. So, what we're seeing is a dynamic where areas that are Democratic, areas that, the majority of people are Democrats, tend to be hit the hardest because they're in cities. But that doesn't mean that it's going to stay that way. As the virus continues to spread, especially if we reopen things, it's going to start hitting Republican states and start hitting rural areas particularly hard. And that's not going to be in any way a good situation. And of course, the other concern that we've been having right now is that maybe we should, when we do talk about opening things up, whenever that discussion happens, and we can debate when that we should start having that discussion, is that maybe we should reopen in sectors. So we heard that agreement that sort of the sort of West Coast states are going to agree to open up at the same time. And of course, the reason for that is we don't want hotbeds where, one state, so for instance, Georgia right now is talking about opening back up. Texas is talking about opening back up. If they reopen, then we could end up in a situation where here, where I am in Virginia, we would need to stay closed longer, right? Because then a bunch of people are in Georgia and they start getting infected, the virus numbers start going up, and then it starts spreading all across, all across here and all across everywhere. And then, the Virginia right now has a stay-at-home order until June 10th, and will be reopening at June 11th, but we might need to push that stuff back if Georgia reopens. And so it's really, in many respects, it's a coordination problem, right? Because every particular state can get a serious advantage by reopening, but if they reopen in the short, even though that might benefit them in the short run to have to stop, they're worried about state budgets, et cetera, which Mitch McConnell is saying that, we're just going to let states go bankrupt. That's not a solution. That's not an answer. That's not going to encourage states to be that's right. Like that is a terrible idea in my opinion. But right. So we're having a serious debate about how we actually coordinate this thing, how we actually get things opened up. Donald Trump saying that he has complete control over this thing. Other constitutional scholars disagreeing. But regardless of whether or not who has the authority or who has the control, it is quite clear that we need to be working together and collaborating on this thing and making sure that we do open up around the same time and not just create hotbeds in one area so then one state opens up and then it spreads. That's how overall the economic damage across America ends up being incredibly bad. Now, the other thing that I do want to just sort of touch on here is, in that full interview, which I didn't quite show you, Dan Patrick talks a little bit about his faith, especially in the one a month ago, in the interview with Dan Patrick and Tucker Carlson, like a month ago, he talks about his faith and how his faith leads him to an ethic of sacrifice, right? And it is true, right? The Bible says, for instance, that, there's no love greater than this, that you lay down your life for another. And Dan Patrick is saying that he's willing to sacrifice for other people. He thinks that, we should consider being willing to take the sacrifice so that other people, don't have to hurt. But the thing that Dan Patrick kind of misses in this, and look, I was raised a Christian. I was raised into that same sort of moral tradition that Dan Patrick speaks from. And, but the thing though that I think he's missing there is that you'll notice that in the Christian tradition, the reason, right, who sacrifices in the Christian tradition? God, the highest being, sacrifices for us lowly people so that then we could have a communal life together. In the same way, the same situation that we're in right now, someone somehow needs to sacrifice so that we can have a communal life together, so that we can live together and, be able to do our things on a daily basis, how we usually do it. Somebody somehow needs to sacrifice. But the lesson of Christianity should teach us that it's the highest up, it's the wealthiest people who need to sacrifice for the lowest people. We couldn't, as in the Christian tradition and Christian theology, it was humans couldn't have made the sacrifice. Humans couldn't have sacrificed so that we could have have a communal life with God. That would have been impossible, right? Only God could have sacrificed for us. And so I think in the same way, only rich people can sacrifice. And I don't particularly like, just as a Christian, I'm not particularly happy seeing Dan Patrick talking about, the Christian ethic and how, oh, well, this means that the poor should have to sacrifice for the rich. I don't like that. I'm quite offended by that. And I, as a Christian, I wanted to make sure that I talked about that. But yeah, so that's just sort of my 2 cents on some of this stuff. So if you like the video, I'd really appreciate it if you hit the like button and consider subscribing. Thanks.